Good morning, everybody. Hemshech Beis, Volume 2. We are at the bottom of page 1202. And this new paragraph on 1202, the Rebbe Rashab asked the question, after finishing the discussion about how Teshuva brings healing, the lower Teshuva, the higher Teshuva, that it heals and repairs the wounds, and also reaches into the deepest levels, that's the higher Teshuva, and draws out from the source to basically uproot the illness at its root, at its source. So then he says, so why does it say Teshuva la'olam? The Gdei Teshuva is great, that brings healing to the world. Why does the world need healing? And the Rebbe Rashab, quoting the Medrash Kehelis Rabbah, the Medrash Kehelis, Der Helech v'der Ba, says that God, Machatzti v'ani erpa, that God created a partition, a division between Elyonim and Tachteim, the higher and the lower. In the higher, you have Chayim, life, and in the lower domain, you have death. And he went on to explain the Rebbe Rashab, what is these partition? So this brings us back to the discussion of partitions much earlier in this volume 2. Talk about the partition, Ba'avdallah, the Rakia, Mavdil, between the higher waters and the lower waters, the spiritual pleasures. Mayim is the root and source of pleasures, of all pleasures. So the spiritual pleasures is Mayim Elyonim, and there's this partition between that and the physical pleasures. And those are the two options we have in life. Are you going to choose the path of life and goodness, or the path of death and badness and evil? And what is the rakia, the firmament, that separates, the partition that separates between the two? That's the rakia. He said that you have two, that it says by Yavdel twice, and apparently that's referring to the Yavdel, the Havdal you have in the Parsois of Gedusha. You have Agdal de Kedusha, Vivdila Parechis, the partition, the curtain in the temple, in the sanctuary, the Mishkan, that's separated between the holy, Kodesh, and Kodesh HaKadosh, which he called between Atzilus and Atik. And this is like the Psik Taima, the hyphen between the two levels of Havaya de La'ela and Havaya de Latata. Again, the divine as it is, in the like Shamayim Mimal, Aretz Mitachas. He doesn't use those words, but it's like almost on the tip of the tongue when you read it. Shamayim Mimal Aretz Mitachas, two levels of Havaya, Havaya de La'ela and Havaya de Latata. That's all in Kedusha. And then there's also Havdalah separating between Kodesh and Chayil, between holiness and the profane, and he says Chayil from the word Chayla. Basically, from a healthy holiness is a healthy state of connection to the divine. As we learned, Vatam Advekim, that when you're connected to the purpose, to godliness, that's health. And Chayil, from the word Chayla, was Klippas Nega. I'm sorry, the Havd Ben Kedesh Ben Chayil, Chayil Lashon Chayil Hain B'Chinas Klippas Nega, Makla Mocher HaKchayli. Mechitza Mafsekes Beineim. He says that's the makif of Levena Zaka, which we call the pure frankincense. And then he says, there's one thing, it's not 100%, when you read it initially, it sounds like it's a distinction between the holy and Klippas Nega. But then afterwards he says the partition itself is Klippas Nega. Because death comes from the Shalosh Klippas Atmei, the three impure shells. And Klippas Nega is the Mechitza Mafsekes. So it's not a contradiction. But initially, when he does say Kodesh v'Chayil, it seems that way. But you could also interpret that Chayil would be Chayli, illness, and the Machla, which is Klippas Nega, is the partition between actual illness and healthy, Kodesh. And as I explained, Klippas Nega is not evil. Klippas Nega is the beginning of the process of concealment within the shell. So it's neutral and can go either direction. That's most likely the pshat here. Okay, so that's the mechitza, because later he says for sure it's Klippas Nega, And that's what it means in the Medrash, that this is the partition I created between Alyenim and Tachtenim. Then he goes on and says, then he adds a line that all the partitions evolve from one another. I think I understand why he's saying that. I'll explain in a moment, but first let me finish the summary. And then he goes and says, now, when will be the healing of these partitions? All of them. Any split, even in Kodesh and Kodesh Kodashim, even the Holy and the Holy of Holies, is still a separation. It's not a bad separation, but it's a separation. And I'll explain again in a moment what the significance of that is in a moment. But L'Asadovi will be Havaya Chod. Havaya Chod. Every Kule Tev Metiv, everything will be seamlessly good. There won't be Tev and Ra, and therefore there won't be a partition between the good and the bad, or between life and death. The chibur of the two will be the joining of the two names of Havaya. And we have Havaya de La'ela, shining, which we learned earlier is the Eira Bligvul. And we're going to go over it soon. He's going to say it in the next page. Specifically, then you have a state where everything is Kulei Tev. Yem shekulei Tev Aruch. Yem shekulei Tev Aruch. An extended, a long day that's only goodness. I mean, you could also bring the Maimer Chazal. He doesn't bring it here, but like when you say Yem shekulei Shabbos Menucha L'chai Elamim in the future, in the 7th millennium. Doesn't bring it because he wants to use the word Tev here, most likely. And it could be that's talking about Shabbos. So I'm just mentioning there's a similar ring to it. Okay. Then he goes like this. Like a sheyir chibur, a beis shemes havaya v'lo yihevdel b'neim klal, and when you'll have the joining of the two levels of havaya, and there won't be any separation, then oz yisrapu, then all the mechitzas, kol ha-mechitzas, all the partitions on all levels will be healed and repaired. Ad gam ha-mechitza, to the point also the mechitza, the lower mechitza, not the. But this is talking about the mechitzas of Kedusha, but also the mechitza between Alyenim Tachtenim, between what he called life and death, and that's Vasidesia Machla, that I will remove this illness. I will remove basically this partition, and there'll be complete seamlessness. So here is the real context of this, which I didn't explain yesterday, but some of you may be obvious to you if you were here when we learned about the mechitzas and the parsayos, Mesachim and Parsayos. So, if you may recall, I mentioned a number of times that the real operative theme that's being discussed since the Pesach Maimer of Ayin Hey, and I'm going back now, we're talking about a long time ago. But I'm just going to go back to where it is. Go back even before he began discussing B'yadaita Ayin. So we're talking now back page 926. So 926, the Rebbe Rasha began with a question, which has been the theme that we're going now. Now we are in 1200, 1202. So we're talking about almost 200 pages. 926, 1202, right? 300, almost 300 pages, actually. 270 pages. So I'm just now discussing for a moment the connections to what we talked about earlier. It was all coming to ask the question there, how is it possible that in a post-Tzimtzum reality, which is predicated on and can only exist after a Tzimtzum, because in the pre-Tzimtzum reality paradigm, there's no room for anything else because all you have is divine consciousness. So how could we ever expect post-Tzimtzum to connect to pre-Tzimtzum? Then the post-Tzimtzum consciousness, we should have a pre-Tzimtzum reality, or the other way around. Post-Tzimtzum reality, we should have a pre-Tzimtzum consciousness. And the truth is, that question was really asked much earlier even. And I'll point out to you, Rebbe Rashab, when he's explaining this long parentheses that we're in the middle of now. We're talking about over a 500-page parentheses. We're discussing the Torah of the Magid. This began, we're talking about now, just give you the page numbers so you get a sense of what we're discussing here. So back on page, where is it? Yeah. Just a minute. Why am I not finding it? Oh yeah, okay, here we are. Page 790 began a long parenthesis explaining the Magid's Torah on Asela Chashtei Chatzetzes, which is the central theme of Ayin Beis. Shtei Chatzetzes. The Chatzetzes, which means trumpets, comes from two words. Chatzetzes, half images. And essentially it's referring to the partnership and the interface between the half above, the divine revelation, and the half below, which is the soul as it comes down to this world. And the Torah of the Magid, which is a short Torah, this is what the Rebbe Rashab has been explaining. All these pages we're learning are really explanation in that. And after a section we're explaining how is it possible to connect these two antithetical realities. So he explained how Atzilus connects to that which is higher than Atzilus. But then he came to the big question and said, all that explains Atzilus. But how about Biyah? That comes after a parsa. And that's a key word now, parsa. It comes after a very strong partition. It says, how do we reach a place of unity? Atzilus is a divine world. So yes, it's a structured world. It's a limited world. It's made of spheres, so we can understand. So we need to understand how that connects. But that's still a divine. It's not subject to a parsa, which he compares to the Tzimtzum Arishan. Because the Tzimtzum Arishan is also between Atzilus the Klolos and Biyad the Klolos. The macrocosm of Atzilus is before the Tzimtzum. The macrocosm of Bri Yitzir is after the Tzimtzum. So a microcosm, the parsa, the partition between Atzilus and Biyah in microcosm is similar to that first Tzimtzum. So he says, how can we bring the divine into the state that's below the Tzimtzum? And to take it even further, just to show the connections that the Rebbe Rashab is tying all these knots together now, he also brought on page 840 that there's the Magid's Torah has the words Eish Hey and Eish Yud. Ish. And he says it's Eish Chera v'Eish Levana, the dark fire and the light fire. And he uses that to explain again this unity between the Chatzoi Tzuras, the two halves. And then he asked the question, as I said, I'm just looking for the page, exactly where he goes there. It says, how do we bring it down after the parsa? Okay. So where is that? 1 second. Let me just give you the page for that. One minute, please. Okay. I believe it's, let me see, is it Tov Tzadik Vav? Yeah. So on page 896, that's when he begins to go into understanding how to bring it beneath the parsa, that same unity. So when the question in Matzah Zu and Pesach comes up, where he says, how experience pre-Tzimtzum consciousness and a post-Tzimtzum reality, it's the broader question that he already asked, as I said, 896, I said 896, how you bring it beneath the parsa. And then was a long discussion about parsayis, about the partitions. Partitions in Kedusha, the partitions between Kedusha and the opposite of holiness. So now, when we're coming here and explaining it, it's not just out of the blue. It's coming after this long discussion about it. Yeah. A long discussion about it. And what did he answer? that the key is transforming the tzimtzum. To transform the very tzimtzum is the key. You don't want to bypass it. You don't want to surrender to it. So you want to transform it. You transform it by transforming the concealment of your own animal soul, which is the tzimtzum within you. And when you do that, you're able to now, because the whole purpose of the tzimtzum was to reveal. All the Ein Sof before the tzimtzum, its purpose was to be revealed after the tzimtzum, like the teacher who conceals in order to reveal. So as such, once you do your work below, you're transforming the tzimtzum, and therefore what can we do? We can bridge post-tzimtzum with pre-tzimtzum, post-parsa with pre-parsa. So what he's saying right now, the mechitza that he's saying is not just as a tangential point. It's going back to the central theme of Ayin Beis, which is how we connect. So there's a mechitza that was created in order there to be a higher and a lower on the second day of creation. And our mission, just as it is to transform the tzimtzum, is also to remove this mechitza. We do the best through our Aveda, which is our Aveda of Torah mitzvahs and Teshuva, like he said. The Teshuva Tata and Teshuva Ilah. And then God, L'asad Lave, will do his part and completely remove Machatzti V'ani Erpa. He'll completely remove all the mechitzas. So this explains, first of all, why this is so important to the whole hemshech, of the whole flow of the ideas. And second of all, it also explains that the connection that he says that all the pasois mishtalshul, they all evolve from one another. You know why? Because if there was no tzimtzum harishon that separated between the habligvul and the hagvul, between the two names of Havaya, you wouldn't have all the other partitions, because you wouldn't have the possibility, if you wouldn't even have independent consciousness, let alone that someone can choose to transgress. So basically, what is coming out of this that I'm starting to sense is that what he spoke before about chelas ava, which is the highest level, when you're seeing the divine but you can't quite have it, that's also a mechitza. But that's a mechitza in kedusha. That's like between holy and holy of holies, or even higher than that. And ultimately, if there wasn't that schism, you wouldn't have lower schism. So then when he moves from there to lower levels of cheli, of illness, where there's the chelas ava, that's the highest level. The cheli between having the 49 gates and lacking the 50th, which is riyah, vision, which he called bedakus, illness bedakus. And then he moved that it could actually cause the cheta egel. That because they moved from riyah to shmiyah, from seeing to hearing. So they went away from that immediate perception where they see the king and they are not distracted. Then they were able to become distracted. And then he went into the cheli of the animal soul, is completely focused on materialism. The cheli that has danger because you cross the line and transgress, or the illness that's no danger, but because it's the indulgence in permissive pleasures, but it also has a ra in it, at least for that moment. So now when you heal all that through Teshuva, which is our Aveda, you're basically repairing to the best of our ability, refuah, maybe refuah le'elim, you're bringing healing, fixing these schisms all the way to the highest levels, and then God will do his part, as he says, machatzti, and will remove all the partitions altogether. And then we will only have that seamless flow of goodness. I should mention, even though he doesn't say it right here, but he did say earlier, to say there will be no partitions is not correct either. He means here the negative aspects of it, meaning the feeling of separation, like the lower waters seeking to cry to reach the higher waters, as we had learned about, which, by the way, was the beginning of chelas of the chela. Nehura Tata crying out to Nehura Ilah. Where was that? That was back on page 1192. But then there was a piece, if you may remember, Prozes Teshuv Yerushalayim, Chemas Eish, trying to find where that is, where he said there will be a chema, there will be a wall, but it will not be a wall of stone, it will be a wall of fire. So you see from that there will be concept of a partition, but it's a very different partition. It's basically the partition itself is made of fire, of light. I'm just trying to find where that was. I believe was on the left side of the page. I think it was 1193 or earlier. It was a parentheses, maybe even later. Yeah, page 1197. He says, "Yes, Shleimer. There'll be Riyas Samachus and there'll be Shuv. There'll be B'derech Pella, and that's Vani Elo Chemes Eish. That the Rishpei Eish, which now is like a yearning and an aching to reach upward, will be in a state of Shuv, and that's the Chemes Eish. But it's not a contradiction, because even if there is, it's going to be also made of, the partition itself will also be part of the whole process. In other words, there will be, as it says, a person will no longer teach the other, a friend, because everyone will know me, God, I see, from young to old. So from small to great. Which means that even though on one hand will be Oisi, everyone will know Atzmus, but there'll still be Ktanim and Gdelam. So the idea, what he's saying about the elimination of partitions, he means partitions in the context of a Tzimtzum, that it won't be a form of Tzimtzum and concealment, whether it's a concealment, a partition between the higher level, between Havaya de Le'ela and Havaya de Latata, or a concealment between Chedesh and Chayil, between healthy and unhealthy. So that will be gone. But to say there won't be structure, he doesn't say that. I'm just pointing out that final point. So to sum up what I just said was, and I hope I wasn't any over your heads, that it was really, I tried to explain how this piece is really connecting themes that go back hundreds of pages now, both in the context of the Parsa, and also that the Parsois are connected to one another. And of course here, when he said earlier that, which began the Shvuos Maimarim of Ayin Hey. B'shamayim emal v'ala oretz mitochas. Ki Havaya olikim b'shamayim emal v'ala oretz mitochas. Shamayim emal is Havaya de Le'ela. Shamayim oretz mitochas is Havaya de Latata. The Ayin of the Yesh Miti and the Ayin of the Yesh Haniva, respectively. And that there'll be the connection that firstly will connect to the Ayin, to the divine within existence. That was like Sumar Menechem, where we can relate to it. And it's something that is more on the level of relates to existence. We will then, there's also be b'shamayim emal, Havaya de Le'ela, connecting to the divine as it's beyond existence. And of course, there'll be the joining of the two. B'shamayim emal oretz mitachas, Havaya de Le'ela and Havaya de Latata. And that is the Aveda we do through our tshuva, through our work from the bottom up. Like he said, there's the Aveda of Torah mitzvahs, there's the Aveda of Reach, like he said, by Samchuni, Basheshes, Rafduni Tapuchim, he said Tapuchim ultimately is the Reach of Tapuchim is higher than the Reach of mitzvahs, is the Reach of Tefillah and Tshuva. So through our work on that level, we do the healing, both of ourselves and the world, and repair as much as we can. And ultimately, like you said now, that God will do the final repair and healing, that will do the ani erpa and remove all the mechitzas, even the mechitzah between alyanim and tachtenim, between life and death, removing the machla, the root of the illness from its root. Okay, so that sums up what we learned, plus a lot more, because I explained it in context of everything we learned. Because I went over quite a lot of material here in short, if somebody wants a further explanation or you have any questions, I'll be happy to take it. And then we'll continue from the bottom of page 1202.
If it's not too much of a, I have a question. Can you hear me, Rabbi?
I hear you, yes.
Yeah. If it's too much of a subplot or a sub-discussion, then I'll do it offline. But can you briefly, like Oregel Achas, explain what it means to have a separation of fire, so to speak, meaning that there's not going to be a complete disassembly of the structure of the Seder Hishtal Shalus, but yet there's still going to be a merger of the two worlds. What is the function of that, or what's the nature of of a sort of a merger between the worlds, but not really a merger?
Because God wants a dir b'tachtenim. He wants us to exist, and existence is defined by structure. He doesn't want a reality, because before creation, he had the total seamless reality without structure. That is not a great achievement. He wants that wants the beyond structure within structure.
Got it. Thank you. That's a great short answer. Thank you.
Okay, good. So let me continue on, unless any other questions? No, okay.
Reb Simon, the Rambam is not mentioning the Lemiktanum ve'ad Gedoylom in Hilches Malachim in Mishnah Torah.
He doesn't mention Kulim Yedu Eisi either.
Okay, but that's okay. He's saying
he doesn't bring that posuk. He brings Malar is Deis Hashem, Kamayim Liyam Mechas.
Yeah.
You're asking why he doesn't bring that posuk?
No, I'm just the mayor. I'm not asking.
Oh, yeah. Maybe it's not a game halacha.
Das ist Shem Bilvod, yes, all Chachamim Gdelim, Yedim Goram Astumim, Yesim Adagas Verom, Mishnama, Malot is Havaya, Kamayim Liyam Mechas. That's it.
Okay. Okay, so continuing now, bottom of page 1202, the Rebbe Rashab continues. And furthermore, or moreover, even more, even more than what we said now. So after he said that'll be completely the Havaya D'Leila, Havaya D'Latata will be one. And Mamela, all the mechitzas will be healed. So he says more than that. Not only will the machla be removed, machla. And machla, we said, is both the partition and also, of course, all the illness that follows from that. No longer will the mechitza between life and death be removed, but there'll be also a transformation. Hasidesi is just removing. That the negative that was before negative, that was like what he called before tachtenim, the mechitza, the partition between tachtenim, where you have tev. His expression was el yenim chayim, that tachtenim mesim. So he says now it will be transformed to goodness and to embrius and to health. So if you remember the language, and the medrash was, just go back to 4 lines from the top of the paragraph, he says, I will wound and I will heal. I will make us I've created, I built a partition between above and below. Above there's life, and tachtenim below there's death. So he says, so you can ask the question, what do you need this last line? He already said. I'm sorry. What do you need oisa mechitza? He could just say that this mechitza that I created, I will heal and I will remove. But he says, oisa mechitza ani chayzer u'merapa esa. That very mechitza that I created, that separates life and death and allows for death and illness and everything that we learned, that very mechitza I will heal. And the Rebbe Rashab is medayik, that the very mechitza, so I won't just remove it, but I'll actually heal it. And that's the transformation, that it will become, like he says, be transformed to goodness and to healing. And this is what means, remember his initial question was, why does the world need healing? So he says, the beginning of the top of the paragraph, he said, the first line of the paragraph, he said, what's mevi? So he says, this is the meaning, that refuah will be brought to the world, that in the world, there'll be a revelation of the supernal, of higher life. The level of the infinite divine light, which is not just chayim, it's chaya chayim, the life of all life, the source of all life, Baruch Hu. So he explains, So, in other words, the fuah is to the world, le'elam. The Eid, the Seder Ishtalshlus, page 1203. Because the Eid of Seder Ishtalshlus, yes, b'zem esachim aparsayis, as we just learned. In Seder Ishtalshlus, the structure of Seder Ishtalshlus, by definition, structure always has in it besachim aparsayis, partitions and curtains, or partitions and dividers, or shrouds. I mean, there's different ways you can translate it. To the point that there could be actually a hefsek, an interruption, a separation. Remember, we learned before, like a havdalah, not only a havdalah, a pirud, a nifrid. So why does he say it this way? Because we said mesachim parsois could also be in holiness. That's not a hefsek. Meaning, that's the holy, and the holy of holies, you need to have a havdalah separation between them. But why does he say chaz v'shalom? Because he's talking here hefsek as separating for the divine source, something that becomes chayil, ma'avdal ben kedesh v'chayil, chayil from the word chayla, illness. So in Seder Ishtalshlus, the way that God created existence, like we said with the human being, even a healthy human being, completely healthy, has mesachim parsois. We have our blood circulation flowing, we have our oxygen flowing, but we also have valves and gauges, and to regulate the flow, it's full of mesachim parsois. I mentioned a few yesterday, whether it's the throat, whether it's the other parts of the body that close and open as different circulation flows through our systems, even the very valves of the heart, they contract and expand. These are all mesachim parsois to make sure the flow is proper, because if it was just one seamless flow, that would not be good. So the fact that existence by definition has not just levels and the flowing of energy, but it also has mesachim parsois. In other words, addition to eris and kalim, as we learned earlier as well, in addition to the energies and the containers, we also have, he's called the vushim, heichalis, parsois. We also have these partitions. For example, when you take a piece of food in your mouth, in a healthy person, the air pipe, the windpipe will close to make sure the food doesn't go there. So there's a process that of regulation that goes on. Same thing as say there's talshlus, it's mesachim parsois to the point of a hefsek. So, for example, the parsa above Atzilus is more like between Atik and Atzilus. That's vivdila parechis, between the holy of holies and the holy. But what about the parech? What about the distinction between Beis Hamikdash and outside of the Beis Hamikdash, or outside of the Beis Hamikdash and Yerushalayim, or Yerushalayim and the other cities, or Eretz Yisrael and the rest of the world? So you see there are partitions everywhere. Eser Kadeshus Hain, the Mishnah says, there are 10 levels of holiness. So you have Ben Kedesh L'Kedesh, Ben Kedesh L'Kedesh Kadashim, Ben Kedesh L'Chel, and so on. So that is what marks Seder Ishtalshlus. Aval Gili Shem Havaya de Le'elah. Now he's explaining what means Refuah Le'elam. So Refuah Le'elam doesn't just mean, obviously it means also healing to something that's ill, but it's also healing to the mechitzas. That's where he's going now. That it's also a healing to remove all these partitions that conceal the divine. So he says now, that is Seder Ishtalshlus, that has mesachim and parsois. It has partitions and curtains and dividers and so on. Aval Gili Shem Havaya de Le'elah, but the revelation of the higher Shem Havaya, Hu b'chinas chayim amitim, that's the level of true life, which means the divine life. In other words, not the life tachtenim where we have life, but it's temporary. And ultimately there's death. But this is emes chayim amitim v'ze'in harafu le'elam. That means the ultimate healing to the world. Shemerapa mechitza liyas gilib b'chinas chayim amitim. That it heals and repairs the mechitza between life and death. The mechitza between alyenim and tachtenim. So in other words, it's much more than just God will bring healing to a human being. The very existence, Olam refers to Kol Seder Ishtalshlus. Olam means the structure of existence itself is defined by all these different partitions and curtains and dividers. that will be healed. That Chaim Amitim, which comes from Havaya De'Leila, will no longer be receded due to the Tzimtzum. And due to the concealments, it'll be illuminate and shine and bring Chaim Amitim all the way through. It'll permeate all of existence. Now, of course, this is after the Aveda. The Tzimtzum Arishin, of course, is the first parsa, if you want to call it that. There are places that talks about why it's not called a parsa in Torah and other places, but the point is, it is a concealment. But essentially, the healing of Refuah Le'elam is the healing and repair of the mechitza, the ultimate, the mechitza between Havaya De'Leila and the rest of existence, Havaya De'Tata and the rest of reality, Chaim Amitim. For who inyan, ve'emes Havaya Le'elam, and that's what means emes Havaya. Usually we type that the truth of God is forever. But he's typing emes Havaya Le'elam. It's bringing the truth of godliness Le'elam into the world. B'chinas emes shel Havaya. The emes of Havaya, which means Havaya De'Leila, is going to be not just permanent, but not just Le'elam is forever, eternal, permanent, but it's Le'elam is being nimshach and drawn into the world. Just like the Alter Rebbe, the Baal Shem Tov quotes the Alter Rebbe citing the Baal Shem Tov, Le'elam Hashem dvarchav nitzah b'shamayim. So the simple interpretation is Le'elam, God's word is always is permanent, b'shamayim, in heaven. But he teaches Le'elam Hashem dvarchav nitzah b'shamayim is that the words that God uses to create the Olam is always permanently embedded in there. Okay. Like it says elsewhere, the Shem Havaya the Latata, the Shem Havaya, the lower Shem Havaya that relates to and enters into existence. As we learned earlier, there the Tzimtzum has an impact because it conceals it from existence. Havaya the Le'el, the Tzimtzum's impact that it recedes. So he says, it says elsewhere, the Shem Havaya who are emes the Shem Elikim. The lower Shem Havaya is the emes of the name of Elikim. In other words, it's also God's name, but it's God's name, the truth of God's name as it relates to existence. Aval emes Havaya, when you say emes Havaya, who b'chinas Shem Havaya de Le'ela, that's referring to the higher name of Havaya, and what? Shemeir begili be'elam. That now radiates and shines, and illuminates in a revealed way, ba'elam, in the world.
So it's not a mechitza then. It's not really a mechitza.
What's that? What do you mean not really? No mechitza at all. He says he heals the
no
mechitza.
Mechitza at all, right. Yerape a mechitza means no mechitza.
He says before, he says removes the mechitza, but he also transforms it. The table of Brius. If you look earlier, he speaks about everything as the mechitzas. Yeah, that he removes it. It says clearly the words are ani merapa isa. Isa mechitza, ani merapa isa. Okay.
Yeah.
So how do we get the gilizeh? So how do we achieve this level? So right now, is it through our Aveda or is it through God? So obviously we have to address that. So he's going to say, our Aveda sets the stage for this and brings it down as much as we can, and God will finish. He says like this: the gilizeh, and this revelation of Havaya de Le'ela, that was due to that first there was a mechitza between Havaya de Le'ela, Havaya de L'tata, psik taima. Remember the psik, the hyphen, the gavayu. That separates them. He says this gilui that comes now, that where it's, in other words, crossing the mechitza is being eliminated. So now Havaya de Le'ela enters into our existence. This gilui comes while they had tshuva. This comes through tshuva. Through our work of tshuva, shemasir kol ha'alamas v'asteirim, that removes all the concealments and the coverings, benafshei, in the person's soul, in the person's spirit. Umizgala pnimius ve'emek hanefesh. And what's revealed is the inner and the depth of the nefesh. Remember on last page, 1202, he said that tshuva has two levels. Tshuva tata, tshuva ilah. So one is to remove the concealments by what? By feeling sad, mismarmer. You feel sad over your situation of transgression and whatever that chayli may be, whether it's a chayli sheyesh b'sakana, ein b'sakana, whatever level, there's a level of tshuva that feels sad. it brings a person to total remorse and Kabbalah Teva Lahaba, and he says that cleans up the wound. That's Mamala Apgam, as he said. That's Shuvatata, the Sakana Pagam, rather, to repair the wound. So there you go. And then he said, comes Shuvilah, is that the cry from within, Pnimis Ve'emek HaNefesh, is revealed. So that's the work we do. So we're removing the concealments within ourselves, and we're revealing the true Pnimis. And remember, we learned that when a person does that, God responds, Mema'amakim, from Emek Pnimius Atzmus Ein Sof. So in other words, we do it on our level. We can live in a world like we do. To put it in simple terms, we live in this world. This world has all kinds of concealments to the point that can cause someone to actually transgress or indulge even in permissible desires that we learned. Basically, to behave in an unhealthy spiritual way by disconnecting from godliness. That's a cheli. That's a split. That's a mechitza. More than just a mechitza. That's a actual illness. How do we repair that? We do tshuva. So we repair that schism, that dissonance, if you wish, dissonance. That's in the benafshe. And we also reveal the inner self that was concealed. That's basically the Havaya de Latata, Havaya de Leila, and Aveda. Havaya de Latata is revealing the divine to remove the concealments. Havaya de Leila is revealing the emek pnimius of the nefesh. Ayidezeh, masir kol hamechitzas, and through that it removes all the partitions, all the dividers. The B'Sheirish Arishin, what I said before, because in the B'Sheirish Arishin, in the initial root, the first root, where all these mechitzas start, Hu B'chinas HaTzimtzum Arishin. In the first root of all these partitions begins with what? With the Tzimtzum Arishin, because that was the first place where God separated. He separated between the higher, the Eirei Sof Lifnei HaTzimtzum, and the Kav, that would come after the Tzimtzum, between the Eirei Sof and the Eir HaGvul, and all the other things that Tzimtzum affected. So that's the beginning, the root of it all. In that first initial Tzimtzum that was in Eir Ein Sof. And now now you have the concealments. The concealments can bring all the way to Yachaliyas Hefsek Chaz v'Shalom, to create an actual separation and a detachment. But now through Teshuva, we're working our way up. We're removing the concealments. As I said, this was the theme throughout the last hundreds of pages, how we transform the Tzimtzum. We don't bypass it. We don't surrender to it. We transform it. We transform the very mechitza through Teshuva by removing the concealment in our own lives through Teshuva, and by reaching the deeper parts of who we are within us. Through that, you remove all the mechitzas. The first root is the Tzimtzum Arishei Be'er Ein Sof, Umamshich B'gilei B'chinas Shem Havaya de Le'elo, and draws down the revelation of the higher Havaya, Shezeh B'chinas Eir Ein Sof HaBligvul. That's the Eir Ein Sof HaBligvul, which receded when the Tzimtzum took place, became concealed from us, not from itself, from us. So now you reverse the process through Teshuva, through transforming the Tzimtzum within us. We are able to remove all these mechitzas, trace our way back, redirect our way back to the earliest stage of the Tzimtzum Arishin, and reveal the Havaya de Leila that's pre-Tzimtzum Eir Ein Sof HaBligvul. Okay. So what the Rebbe Rashab really did in these few lines, especially if you remember he's really brought together almost 400 pages, is summing up the theme, but connecting it also now to what we discussed in the last few pages about Chelas Ava. But you start seeing now where there's a really recurrent, there's a thread that connects it all. This is not just went off on a side to talk about Havaya Elikim by Eliyahu, which we're going to learn shortly. But you see here how he's connecting the whole idea of transforming the Tzimtzum and all the mechitzas And through tshuva, this is the Aveda of transforming this world and ultimately opening us up to be able to experience Pre-Tzimtzum consciousness, which is the Havaya de Le'ela. Yeah. As I explained, and I'll probably explain more, but let me stop here and let's see if anybody wants to ask any questions. It's all clear? Good. Okay, I'm glad to hear that. If I had my preference, I'd probably go back 300-400 pages and just read quickly, at least, if not more in depth, because this is very, very clearly tying up, as I mentioned. That's why I brought all those pages before. We're going back. Wow. So really revealing the divine, the highest level. So that's the essential theme of Ayin Beis, the interface between godliness and existence. And that's now playing itself out here in the context of the Tzimtzum, the Mechitzas, the Refuah. I'm just thinking out loud. I'm just summing it up in my own mind. And that's going to be Havaya, Vaydaita Hashem, Vaydaita Yem, V'shavesa levavecha ki Hashem hu Elikim, both b'shamayim mimal, ala oretz mitachas. Wow, Havaya de Le'ela, Havaya de Latata. The Riyah that we see be'enei basa sumar menechem in Havaya de Latata, ala oretz mitachas, and now even higher to actually see with the En HaSeichel, Havaya de Le'ela, which is the Erein Sof. And through Chachma Bina Das, we come to fully perceive it as if it's a reality, but we feel Chelas Ava. We're lacking it unless you have, so that's the Samchuni Ba'asheshes and Avduni B'tapuchim, that's the Aveda of Tshuva. First, the Aveda of Primis HaTeira, Yayin, Nichnas Yayin Yotze Sod, and then the Aveda of Tshuva, Tefillah and Tshuva, that helps heal Chelas Ava Oni. Because tshuva reaches all the way to this point that it heals the cheli. Yeah, that's important. That was on page, we started the whole thing with Samchuni. On page 1195. And then that in turn draws down Havaya de Le'ela. And La'asid Law, we will have the complete joining and removal of the mechitzas. Because even though he just said tshuva does it, but it's very clear, based on the Medrash and Kehelas Rabbah, that the Eibishter says, Ani erpa, Ani chezer merapa esa mechitza. So the end, as much as we do, we still need the Eibishter, Hasirei Si, he should remove the machlan, he should ultimately remove all these mechitzas, because as much as we do, we can't completely transform the tzimtzum. We do as much as we can. But like it says, as Ruach HaTuma Avim in Haaretz, that God will ultimately be the one that removes the spirit of unholiness and impurity. You know, I'm just explaining, even though he didn't say it yet, but I'm sure that's the pshat. So we do our part as much as we can, which is essentially Maseinu B'Avodesenu, our work in this world, and then God will finish the process La'osid Lovei. But God can't do that La'osid Lovei, so to speak, unless we do our part, because we are products of this tzimtzum, and we need to do our work in transforming, like he said, the alamas v'estadim shebenafshe. That's a very strong word. That means the concealments that exist in the larger world also exist within us. Like we said, that Friedrich Rebbe said, as a elam nasan belibam, as a helam nasan belibam, we have the helam within us. It's given to us, b'shvili nivra helam, in order for us to transform the concealment within you, has the ripple and butterfly effect of healing and revealing and removing the concealment in the entire world. Okay, we haven't finished yet. We're going to get now, he's going to go back to Eliyahu and Vayirapa, but we're coming, so let's use the last few minutes if anybody wants to ask anything, and hopefully Sunday we could finish Maybe we'll finish the Mimer even. That would be good. Before Shavuos, we finish volume 2 of Ayin Beis, which is, by the way, a Shavuos Hemshech that began in the year 1912. We're now 109 years later from when Hemshech Ayin Beis began. And we're learning now around 9 years. Yeah. Okay, so anybody want to ask anything?
I have a question about the difference between L'Rapa et Mechitzos and Lahasirot. So healing them would seem to suggest sort of, I don't know, making the blockage more transparent, letting the light through. But removing them is an entirely different thing. And that goes to the question you said, that the structure of the Seder Hashtash is not going to change. It's still going to be, you said some parochet of fire or something like that. And I know I didn't read the prior material, so I don't want to, maybe I'm just mixing ideas that shouldn't be mixed, but I'm a little confused when it says to heal the mechitzos, that doesn't mean the mechitzos are going away, but that he does say lahasir, to remove. So I'm trying to understand the difference between l'rapa and lahasir, and also the Indian that you said, well, the mechitzos are going to be removed, but there's still going to be a seder. So, I mean, I can understand there being different levels, different realms of godliness, atzilus and biyah, etc. But the light, the or ein sof, the or bleak will still is able to transcend down through them. In other words, so there's still a separation. But basically,
so that's why I preempted this by saying before, and I'll just repeat it, that there's two aspects to a mechitza. One is that it conceals, and one that it divides. Concealment will be removed, and not only that, he says, in addition to remove, they'll be transformed to good. But the fact structure is not necessarily concealment. The fact that you have a windpipe and a food pipe, or the fact that we have water and land, and there's a partition between them, doesn't make it a concealment. It just means it's two different realities. There's a separation between mineral, vegetable, animal, and man. There's a difference between a Kohen, a Levi, and a Yisrael. There's a difference between Kodesh, Kadoshim, and Kodesh. So we have, the world is filled with, the tree is not a frog, and a frog is not a cloud, and a cloud is not a mountain. That does not indicate concealment. That just means there's a distinction. So the element of concealment that can lead to a point where you can actually defy God is really the theme that we're talking about here. A mechitza between life and death, between healthy and unhealthy. So bottom line is that even when there's the revelation of Havaya de Le'ela, which initially all these structures could not exist unless you had the Tzimtzum Arishan. You had to conceal Havaya de Le'ela, because if the Eir Ein Sof Ablikvul would have been revealed, there'd be no room for existence. Now there is room for existence. Through our work, we transform the concealments within ourselves, within the world around us, and then we have a whole full world that radiates with divine, the highest levels of divine energy. Blikvul. Okay.
Thank you.
So now, we'll stop here. The next section, he goes back to Vayirapa, the story with Eliyahu that began a while back. But anybody have any other questions? Okay.
Just for curiosity,
Vayirapa goes back to page 1192. I'm sorry?
Just for curiosity, I know we didn't learn it, but in 2 lines ahead, he's giving abbreviation, which I cannot figure out what it is.
Well, since it's ahead, why don't we just wait when we learn it?
Oh, you're not learning it in the next 2 minutes.
No. Well, we're on Sunday. I'll continue on Sunday. I'll try to finish this mimer.
Ches Vov Hey. Could you tell us what Kimoshe Kosu be Ches Vov Hey? What is Ches Vov Hey?
Cheves Alavavos.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Okay. So everybody,
have a good Shabbos, Rabbi.
We'll stop here in the middle of beginning of